Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Susan Ward, and I'm with the Bureau of Student Wellness with the New Hampshire Department of Education. And I truly want to thank all of you school administrators, educators, and school staff for all that you've done throughout the summer, the upcoming weeks to prepare for the return of school. And I want to acknowledge the anxiety, uncertainty, and stress that really comes with that. And just to give you a heartfelt thank you for all that you do and just let you know you are appreciated. And I also want to thank the members of our live panel today speaking with us about reporting abuse and neglect for educators in the time of COVID and how educators can connect parents and families with the right resources. So I'd love to take a minute and just go around and introduce everyone on the panel today. So I'm just going to go kind of from left to right is what I see it. So I'd like to introduce Joe Ribson, if you want to say a little bit about what you do.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining, and thank you all for your service to our kids and families right now. It's a tough time for everybody, and I know everyone's doing a ton to try to keep our kids and families safe and strong. I'm Joe Ribson again. I'm the director of DCYF, and I look forward to sharing some information with you today.
Thank you. And on the other side of me is Nicole. I'd love to introduce Nicole and have you tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hey, thanks, Susan. Hi, everyone. I want to echo Joe's and Susan's sentiments and thank everyone that's involved in education for all you're doing right now. Certainly not an easy task, but we appreciate you. And my name is Nicole Adu. I am the Victim Services Director for the Granite State Children's Alliance, which is the chapter organization for all of the child advocacy centers here in New Hampshire. And child advocacy centers provide forensic interview and follow-up services for children who are suspected to be victims of criminal child abuse, criminal child sexual abuse, or criminal neglect.
Thank you so much. All right. And I'll just kind of go down to my left now is Jana from Granite State Children's Alliance.
Hi there. Thank you everyone for being so important and so helpful for our children. Educators are so important to us. I am the Education and Outreach Program Manager for the Granite State Children's Alliance. So along with working with Nicole, I also do a lot of the Know and Tell, which is our education program, and I will be keeping you guys up to date with different resources for you guys to use during this.
Great. Thank you so much. And then the next person on the list is Maura. If you could tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Moira O'Neill. I'm the Child Advocate from the Office of the Child Advocate, and we are an independent state agency that now provides oversight of all children's services that are provided or supported by the state. And I can tell you from what we are hearing around town and what we're reading about and seeing with kids in the office as well is that this is really the year of the teacher. It's terrific to be able to be with you today. Started out a little bit that nurses were on everybody's minds, but teachers are hanging in there and doing an impossible job. So I'm really glad to be able to be here and talk about resources for you today. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'd love to introduce Marty.
Hi, I'm Marty Sink. I'm CEO at CASA of New Hampshire. And like the others, thank you for your incredible creativity, flexibility, tenacity. It's truly a challenging time for so many of our kids. And you guys are right down there in the trenches on the battlefields with these kiddos. I'm sure many of you are familiar with CASA, and educators, teachers are one of the most valuable resources for us as our advocates are bringing to the court's attention what's in the best interest of these children. And so thank you for what you do. And it's really a delight to be with you.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that takes care of introductions, and I'm going to just turn this over to Joe to give us some more information about why we're here today.
Great, thank you, Susan. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint with some data, so just give me one moment, bear with me. So can everybody see that? I'll look for nods in the window. Yes, okay. So DCYF, and in partnership with a lot of the folks on this this Zoom right now, and with some folks who are going to be joining you for a Zoom, I believe, next week, have been getting together regularly to look at what we're seeing within the system data and what the implications are for the kids and families that we serve, and trying to come up with ways to still keep kids safe and families strong during this time. And what I'm going to share with you today is some of the data that we've been seeing, and a little bit specific to education. So what we're seeing here, this is the last 3 years worth of data of calls to our central intake, the child abuse hotline. You'll see similar structure in a couple of these slides. The green is 2018, the orange is 2019, and the blue is 2020. And you can see going back to March, and this is in bi-weekly chunks, going back to March, right, in a typical week, in the prior years, we would have had somewhere around 1,100 calls, 1,200 calls in a given week. And that as soon as COVID really hit and the world started to close down, the call volume to intake really plummeted from that 1,100 a week down to about 650 a week. And you see that trend line really continue through all of March, April, into May. It starts picking up a little bit more. Schools remain closed, but we do see it start to pick up a little bit more. And then some of the data I'll show in a minute can kind of show us where that's coming from. And then in the summertime, when call volume typically goes down because schools are closed, we see that the call volume finally starts to rebound into what's kind of typical for the summer, right? So this is typical call volume during the summer, which is better than it was in the early weeks of COVID. And now this last 2-week period when schools typically are getting back in, but right now, unfortunately, a lot of the schools, took a little bit longer to get started, waited till after Labor Day for the reasons of implementing the new remote learning plans and hybrid plans and everything else. We haven't seen the call volume pick up yet, although I think we do anticipate that in the next cut of the data that everyone will be able to see on the DCYF website. We post this every 2 weeks. We're hoping that we'll start to see that number approximate something closer to what's typical. So we hope to see that number start to climb. So this chart, I think, gives us kind of a richer information about who we're getting our calls from, and it's a little bit busy, so I'm going to walk you through how to understand it. And again, all these charts get posted on our website every 2 weeks, so you're free to go and look yourself and see kind of how these things are developing. So what you see here, each of these bars, right, represents the total call volume in a month, and each of the colors in the bar represents who the callers are. So this dark blue number, or the dark blue chunk down here at the bottom, is our typical calls from schools, childcare. Summer camps also get included in that. Some of the other kind of high volume ones, this bright yellow are typical call volume from law enforcement. The bright red are calls that come from parents and guardians themselves. The pink from medical folks. So you can see in March, right, in March of 2019, all the way to the left, that's what March of 2019 looked like. And then you see with COVID kind of striking towards the end of March, how call volume shifted within March as a whole. So you saw education reports go down. You saw other categories go down as well. And then April got even more striking. Where really in April, it was education reports were down quite a bit, but actually from all categories, because I think kids and families weren't out in the world the way that they typically are. So even calls from medical providers, calls from parents and guardians themselves, anonymous calls were down, law enforcement calls were slightly down from typical, mental health calls were down. And that trend continued into May, which May is typically one of our busiest months of the year. And this past May, call volume remained drastically down. And then finally, come June, things started for other callers, started coming back into normal. We started receiving close to typical call volume from medical providers and from mental health providers and from law enforcement. And that really sustained throughout the summer of getting pretty typical call volume from those folks. Education, of course, looking a little bit different, because even though the summers are always, schools are always closed in the summer, there's typically more summer programming for kids than occurred this past summer. So even, fewer childcare centers, fewer summer camps, things like that. So we did see those types of calls at a reduced volume over the summer, but not as drastically as I think we had feared. So why this is important, though, is that, all of you, and you're going to hear more about this later, are really the eyes and ears of our kids. And to be able to gather information from them, understand what's happening, and help them. Help them either if you suspect abuse or neglect by making a report to us, or that's not always the right solution, or by helping connect them to other types of services and resources so that their families remain strong and that they don't ever get to the point of needing to be called into us. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. what we see here is kind of our highest volume calls from some of our largest SAUs within the state. So you can kind of see the drop off that occurred in different places. And it really was stark in a lot of places, right? Our biggest districts in Nashua reduced call volume 74%, 81% from schools in Nashua. Rochester reduced call volume by 80+%. Manchester actually did a little bit better than some of the other neighboring districts and some of the other larger districts. Still reduced call volume, but 50% reduction, 60% reduction compared to that really drastic 80% reduction we saw in a lot of other places. And I think why this is important is that we need to know that these kids who are going to school or who are not going to school or being educated in other ways still have that benefit of all of you to support them and to help them figure out what their needs are and make sure that they're safe. This next slide, I think, goes a little bit into further who we received the calls from. And this kind of helps us understand during the last spring period who were still making reports to DCYF regarding abuse or neglect. And it's interesting because I think it can help schools think about how they're using the other people within their systems, right? So if you look at this, our highest call volume typically comes from guidance counselors. The one to the left here, the lighter color, is always the 2019 reporting. The one to the right is always the 2020 reporting. So you see guidance counselors typically are some of our most prolific callers, but during the COVID period, their call volume dropped drastically, 60, 70, 80% reduction. Teachers, by contrast, another high volume caller from schools, we did see some reductions there, but not quite as drastic as we saw in the guidance counselor space. Same thing with principals, right? We saw a reduction in the principal call volume, but not quite as drastically as you saw in the guidance counselor space. But then counselors and therapists within school, really drastic reduction. School social workers, really drastic reduction. School nurses, totally disappeared from reporting during this period. So I think this is important because what it says to me is that the folks who still were having engagement with kids, right? We know teachers were still connecting with kids during this period. We know some of the principals were still connecting with kids, or maybe they were getting the information through the teachers and connecting that way. But those folks who were still connecting with kids still were finding information worthy of making a report. But other folks who maybe weren't having those connections the way they typically do were not. And I think what's really important about this is for schools to think about how are those other folks within your school system, being used to support kids and families right now, even if they're not going eyes on a daily basis. I'll go quickly through this, but what this shows is just what types of allegations we saw moving over time. And if folks are really interested, you can go to the data that's on the website and kind of go back and get a broader view of this, going back into the early COVID period. But the dashed lines just show you kind of what our typical call volume is related to those topics. And then the bars show you what we're actually seeing during the COVID period. And what we're looking for here is just what looked different during the COVID period than how it looks during the rest of the year. And early on, it was clear that substance use, caretaker substance use was really kind of a prevalent issue. Over the summer months, that seemed to dip a little bit, and inadequate basic care, which is kind of a generalized neglect, oftentimes things related to conditions of poverty, really started to pick up more in the late summer as a driver of call volume. The other thing that really stood out, really all the way across the board, almost every single 2-week period, was domestic violence remaining kind of higher than typical as a reason for reports to DCYF. So sharing this really just to help you all understand the types of things that we're seeing and the types of changes we're seeing, and to help you understand what types of things you can think about for the kids and families that you work with. Some of the other data, which I'll go over quickly because it's probably not quite as significant in your day-to-day work, but this is just child protection cases opening each week. The blue line again is 2020, the orange and green are the prior years. And you do see in the early period of COVID, the number of child protection cases that were being opened was really down. But we do see that starting really, mid-May to June, that kind of picks up into typical range. So even though call volume was down, the number of new child abuse and neglect cases that were being opened did start returning to typical ranges in the late spring, early summer. And then similarly, this is child protection removal data. So a lot of folks worry that when you call DCYF, that, you know, the kids are going to be automatically removed and what are the implications of that. And I think it's really important to recognize that it's unusual actually for children to be removed from their homes. The much more typical response is that an assessment is conducted, that an attempt is made to connect that family with supports, and that even if a case ends up opening up, that doesn't necessarily mean the child's going to be removed. It might mean that supports are put into the home to try to strengthen that family in place and not remove the child. So what we see here is that we did see kind of overall child removals from their homes go down, particularly during the early period of COVID. And then again, stay on the lower side, but within typical ranges, again, in the summer months. So another place where I think, you know, as we saw kind of reporting levels level off, we saw kind of these removals and the child protection cases start to level off back to something approximating typical levels. All that's to say that I think we need to keep doing you know, good work in looking out for the well-being of our kids and the needs of our kids, and making those reports to make sure that, you know, if a family really does need to come to our attention, that they are. The last thing I wanted to share with you is this well-being guide, which had been shared with the schools in the springtime. We did update it over the summer. So if you go to the DCYF website, it's there right now, and I'll pull it up live in a moment so folks can see where it is. So the resources on it have been updated over the summertime. So the version you saw in the spring might be a little outdated, and the link is going to be provided within the YouTube chat and description. But what this really is, it's a guide to kind of help all of our community partners, including educators, have conversations with families about what's happening right now during COVID, to recognize that all families are struggling right now, and that it's important for caregivers and for parents to know that there's not shame in having a struggle right now, that that's a normal thing for most families to experience right now, and that what we need to be looking out for is how do we support one another through this. So the front page kind of gives you some questions. It's not meant to be an interrogation where you go through every question, but just some prompting questions for you to think about. And then the back of that page goes through some common resources that you can direct those families to if they need help with any of these areas. And of course, at the bottom, it also highlights the importance of making a referral to DCYF if you do suspect abuse or neglect. But we recognize that most of the time, when you talk to a family, you're not going to immediately suspect abuse or neglect, but you might very often find a family that needs some help. And that's what this is really about, trying to help you help those families. So what we're asking you to do, you know, you can take a fresh look at this guide, you can go to the website and pull this out, and you can use this in your conversations with families. And if you think it's helpful, you can hand it directly out to families too. And some of the messaging we've been using around that, and over this summer, a lot of the families may have received this. We partnered with the Department of Education and the National Guard to distribute 25,000 of these around the state. But the conversation you have with families is, you know, this isn't just about helping that family, but helping that family help another family, right? If we have our families on the ground looking out for one another and helping one another, that too can hopefully help mitigate some of the risks and the stress that our families feel, and thereby ultimately reduce the need to ever call DCYF. I'm going to very quickly pull up the website where you can find this, although there will be a link. So if you go to the DCYF website, if you just Google New Hampshire DCYF, it'll take you to this page. This document here, COVID-19 Resources for Children and Families. You click on that. And here's the well-being guide. You can print this out yourself. It was updated in July because some of the resources had changed since the April publication. And, you know, just walks you right through those questions like I spoke about, and then links you with warm links to these common resources that you can use to try to help support kids and families. So with that, I'm going to hand this off, and unless Susan or anybody else has some clarifying questions for me, and I thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate all that data, and the well-being guide is extremely helpful. Nicole, did you have something that you wanted to add about your findings?
Sure, and mine will be, I don't have the graph, so it'll be a little more anecdotal than Joe's. But so DCYF sees a much larger number of cases than we see at the CACs. I think that, you know, they probably screen in around, I think it's roughly 12,000 cases a year. Correct me if I'm wrong, Joe. We see about 2,000 of those kids at our CACs statewide. And kids come into CACs when the abuse or suspected abuse is to the point where law enforcement and DCYF and prosecution need to consider working together for this case because the kid's been a victim of a crime. So what we saw, we get so many of our referrals from DCYF primarily, and they come in from DCYF and law enforcement, but DCYF is a partner of ours that we work with every day. And as schools closed, our first inclination at CACs was kids aren't going to have anyone to tell, right? So what you saw in Joe's charts was a pretty good reporting level of physical abuse, right? What you didn't see was a reporting level of sexual abuse, because you can't see that normally. And unless a child discloses to you, you're not going to know that's happening. About 60% of the kids that come into our centers are sexual abuse cases. And so that wasn't on the chart at all, because I don't think there was enough to even register. Correct, Joe? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, those were the most frequent allegations. Unfortunately, sexual abuse is one of the rarer allegations that are made, but obviously one of the most impactful and dramatic. What we did see with that, I think you're absolutely right, was in the springtime, we did see those report numbers go down quite a bit. We've seen actually towards the end of August what was actually a bit of a growth in allegations related to sexual abuse, and I think there's still some clarity around whether those are all new instances or whether some of that might be some things that didn't get reported sooner that would have been reported sooner had kids, been speaking to folks the way they typically do.
Right. So we saw about a 69% drop in reports of sexual abuse to our centers in those 2 months, that April and May period when we were really in that lockdown. We did see physical abuse cases come in, but only the most egregious ones that were coming in through the hospitals or with some significant injury. We saw all of that begin to change in June. When the governor said, let's open some things up, let's get some kids back in camp, let's get them in front of, kids began to get in front of those child-facing professionals. And I point this out because it really points out how important educators are to the child protection system. When you weren't involved face-to-face with kids' lives, or you weren't having the more continuous Zoom contact that you're having with kids now that the system has been developed, they really didn't have that safety net to reach out to. So educators are so important, and Jana's going to go over some of the great information we have for educators on how they can assess wellness with kids and what they can do when they have those significant concerns that Joe talked about, where they do need to reach out to DCYF. But just keep in the back of your mind on that giant plate that you have right now, educators, where you're tech support and you're Zooming and you're dealing with 2 days on, 2 days off and cleaning and everything else. We are asking that you do keep in the back of your mind those kids that may not be safe at home or may have abuse and neglect issues, both the signs and what to do when someone discloses to you. You're such an important part of the system.
Thank you so much for that. I think you're right on, Nicole, and thank you for sharing that information. I know you had said Jana's going to share some information, so I'm going to hand that over to you, Jana.
Yeah, so of course we have our Know and Tell e-course, which can be found on knowandtell.org. It's completely online, it's free. We worked with DCYF, so you'll actually be able to see videos of what it's like to make a phone call if you've never had to report to DCYF yet. And we find that teachers really see that and say, oh, it's not as scary as I thought it would be. And you see that there's another person on that line and you guys all just genuinely care about children. So that's a great resource. It's free, knowandtell.org. It will be in the YouTube information as well. But there are other things that we created due to COVID. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, you seeing it now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So this is our 5 actions to protect a child. We ended up creating a Know and Tell Aware program because we understood that now with everything going on with COVID, you don't necessarily have the time right now to get that 3.5-hour training in person that we normally would be doing almost every day. Normally, Steph and I would be doing school trainings September through October very heavily. So we're unable to do that because of COVID, but we wanted to make sure that teachers really did have the information that they needed to feel comfortable and ready to make reports when they had eyes back on children. So this 1 hour training really does go over the fact that you are a mandated reporter. We talk about the signs and also the legal definitions, so you understand what New Hampshire has to say about what the legal definitions of child abuse, sexual abuse, neglect are. The 3 ways to report are really important as well. Teachers, we're hoping now, are reporting confidentially or full disclosure. So that is something we talk about, and we explain to you why that actually is more helpful and a bigger resource for DCYF if they are able to contact you after making that report, if they do have additional questions or need more information. So we go over that pretty well. And then DCYF being open, we make sure you have that phone number. And then we really turn the tides at the end and make you feel empowered as an educator that you really can be the difference for a child, whether this is a neglect issue or physical abuse. No matter what, you can be that starting piece of getting the child the help that they need. And that's how we think of teachers as our superheroes. So that is our 5 actions. It's about a 1 hour presentation, and we are offering that free to school districts that want to take that. Then I'm going to go into 5 warning signs that a child needs help. When COVID hit, we had a lot of teachers asking us questions about, well, how am I still going to be a mandated reporter when I'm not seeing children face to face? What does being a mandated reporter look like in the remote world? So that's when we decided to create this, where we had our mental health clinician that works at one of our CACs come together, and we really started to think about how we could make this work at a remote level. So talking about looking for those signs, but then when you're Zooming, you have the opportunity to kind of see the environment that that child's living in, right? So you might see that there are drugs on a table near the child, or you might see the fighting or domestic violence in the background. So we wanted to make sure that you were starting looking directly at the child, and then you were going around and making sure you were observing everything that you could through that Zoom video, talking about behavior and effect, engagement, and then overall supervision. So this is another helpful tip just when you're making your Zoom calls about the different things that you can be looking at from a remote perspective. And then the last thing we thought was very important was to kind of create a communicating during remote learning tip line. So we know that teachers are so great at building relationships with children. They see our children more than parents do. I mean, they're with their children throughout the day normally. So they've built these relationships. They know how to communicate with children. And oftentimes teachers are getting information that becomes reportable without even trying, without interviewing. It's just very normal conversations to have. So how are you feeling today? Oh, what did you have for breakfast? Different questions like that we were finding were actually giving educators information that gave them the ability to say, ooh, something might be going on. And that actually led to people saying, oh, there are still ways that we can be reporting during COVID. So this is one specifically for teachers. Again, these are all on our Know and Tell website under COVID resources. So it starts with a routine check-in, and then showing reassurance and validation. We know that COVID-19, it was scary in the beginning. It was isolation for children that they were not used to, not seeing their friends, not seeing their teachers. So talking about that and explaining that they are feeling that too, to build that connection with students. And then wellness and observations and responses, just how to start that conversation without interviewing the child, because we never want teachers to interview children. We know that DCYF is highly trained and they know how to do that job, but these are just some basic tips that we can get some information for them if we are concerned about a child or family.
So those are all on our website, Jana. All teachers can find that on the Know and Tell website.
Yes, we have a COVID resources tab right on knowandtell.org where they can find that and a lot of other different things. We had a newsletter with the mental health clinician that are also very helpful that you can find there.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing these resources. And it's great to just be reminded that that's there, and we can just click on the website and really just have that information at our disposal. We can print that out. We can, if we're teaching from home, we can have that right at our desks. We can have it in our desks in our classroom. We can share that with our colleagues and other school staff. So just making sure everyone is on the same page and really just being empowered to be able to use those resources. So thank you. And I have taken the course as well. And I will say I found it to be extremely helpful. I was able to observe the conversation with DCUF on the phone. I walked away without any questions at all. So thank you for that. So in a minute, we'll go into some questions, but I wanted to open this up for Maura and Marty to add any information if you would like to do so.
Go ahead, Marty.
All right, go ahead, Moira.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate hearing about all those resources that even though some of them I know about, I always learn a little bit more. So I'm glad that we're able to share them today. I wanted to add, before I talk about resources, a couple of other things to think about. When you look at child abuse and neglect data across the country, it's more common that children are neglected than that they're abused. And this is really important to think about because it's certainly important that we want to recognize bruises and broken bones. But I think what's going to be something we're going to see rising even more now that the subsidized out of work paychecks have stopped. People have been out of work a lot longer. A lot more businesses are closing now. Is that sort of chronic neglect and being able to watch for those signs of kids who aren't getting enough to eat, aren't getting bathed, aren't getting their needs met, or maybe there's more tension in the family and it's not quite abuse, but it certainly is some difficulties that are going to surely impact children, as you know, for the long run in terms of their development. So it's important to be thinking in that sense. And I think that we've seen nationally, it's more typical that what teachers, educators pick up is that neglect, not so much of the abuse. It's not, a lot of the abuse you'll see police and healthcare workers pick that up because either they're on the scene or they see kids when they come in the hospital. But teachers are really important to identify that neglect aspect of what happens to kids. And the other thing too is, who we're seeing struggle the most in this pandemic with the adjustments in school are kids with disabilities. Are they going to go to school? Are they not going to go to school? Are they cared for? A lot of them get major supports just for getting through the day from their school system. So that's been disrupted. We are having a webinar, the Office of the Child Advocate sponsoring a webinar. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure that you got the link to that, Susan, but I did just email it to you. If you go to our website, in our newsletter, you'll find the link to register for a webinar on child victims with disabilities. So it's really an opportunity to think about those kids and why they're vulnerable and what to look for. I think those are kids we really need to keep elevated in our mind. In terms of resources, I think you've heard about probably one of the most important ones so far, the Know and Tell programs that just help us understand how to recognize kids. The Office of the Child Advocate has for the past almost 3 years now been in a position to promote children's best interest as an overseer of DCYF services. We've now broadened that as of Friday. So we're in a position to be able to help you if you're not really sure of how the system's working, or if you're not finding the system to be responsive to you. It's going to take us a while to become expert on it all, but we're certainly happy to walk with you and sort of figuring out how to navigate resources for the children and families that you serve. So that will be that. So we're one major resource. The other thing that's really important to know about, especially with most of the services that you're going to see are important for kids now under these conditions in the pandemic: child protection, juvenile justice, developmental disability services, early childhood intervention. Those are all programs that come under the Department of Health and Human Services. And the Department of Health and Human Services has an ombudsman who can help you, or who you can refer families to when it seems like there's some disconnects in getting hooked up with the services that you need, or if you feel that you're calling DCYF and you're not being as responsive as you need them to be, or you have information that you need to share. So the DHHS Ombudsman is a really important resource to you. And I think that we've sent that link. And if not, what I always do is just Google New Hampshire Ombudsman and it comes up. So that's really helpful information too. And the other things I wanted to mention were just things to sort of think about. Talking about, we're talking about recognizing safety and unsafe conditions, but also engaging the children you're working with in those conversations, being comfortable talking about body safety, even something as simple as saying, adults really don't require kids to keep secrets. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, make sure you have someone to talk to. And what educators can do too is really set up a system of regularly checking in with families. I know you're really super busy, but because if you're in a scenario where you're not seeing people fully, just taking some time, we found that especially early in the pandemic, but I think now as it's become chronic, people are isolated, like literally and figuratively. And so just checking in, how are you doing? Are you getting what you need? And being familiar with the resources in your area, because I know a lot of educators, come from other districts to work at the schools that they are. So making sure that in that catchment area, where people can get assistance with housing, with food, and other kinds of childcare, other supports, and just making sure 211 is probably the most invaluable resource, because if it seems like a family is struggling, 211 will figure it out if they don't have the information to get access to resources that they need. And we've even talked about, thinking about the curriculum for the Choose Love movement. And that's another one you can Google, but a really good movement that's really promoting the idea of people caring about each other. And we've seen a lot of that in the pandemic, but I think I want to be mindful that we've got to encourage people to sort of keep an eye on their neighbors and care about them. And then some of the obstacles you might worry about are those families that have been chronic. This is a theme that our office has found in some of the reviews we've done. A family that's just consistently had problems. They've been involved with DCYF, they've been involved in the police, and there's sort of a bias that forms where you're just sort of exhausted working from them or with them. So you want to just keep mindful of your own sense and feelings about families, and make sure you put that aside to make sure kids are safe. So those are a few things that I would say are good things to keep in mind. And anytime you have a question, certainly our office, you're welcome to just call and say, I'm not really sure what to do with this. Who should we call? And 211 again is the same with that. Great, thanks.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I don't want to beat a dead horse. I think there are great resources out there for all of you, from the work that Joe's office has done to the Know and Tell program. I think one of the conversations I remember having early on in the pandemic, and Joe was part of those conversations, and so was Moira, was about the fact that many of you already know, or last year you knew who these families were, where there was perhaps chronic neglect or neglect of some sort, or emotional abuse, or physical abuse, and just to be mindful of those, that you sort of have that little thing in the back of your head that they were perhaps at risk before, and now maybe at a greater risk. And I realize that your classrooms have changed, and you might not have the same students in your classroom as you did last year. But that's really important information, I think, to share with each other, that we're constantly looking out for those families who we believe may have some challenges that have gotten even more significant. I think that the severe neglect, those are the cases that the majority of our cases at CASA, in fact, are neglect cases. And just the trauma, the trauma that goes with neglect is so significant and so long lasting. And when we start adding these layers of what the epidemic has done to so many families, I can't imagine how much more trauma some of these kids have been exposed to as a result. So I can only say that you are a lifeline to these children in so many ways. And the work that you're already doing is so significant. And I think what we're sort of asking you to do, which is probably integrated into your daily routine anyway, but just to be so mindful of those kids that are there, that need you now maybe in a different way, and feeling comfortable in sharing and making those reports, which are so important. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, we're all mandated reporters, and it's not just you, teachers, or the medical professionals, but everyone in the state is is a mandated reporter. And that's important for the families to know of these children, and all families in our classrooms, and otherwise to be aware of. So I would just leave you with that, and thank you for what you're doing for New Hampshire's children in some really difficult situations. And I just have to put a plug in for some of the rural areas that are really, really struggling, that struggled early on with technology issues. And I think some of those kids are back in classrooms because they're smaller schools, which is terrific. But they have had challenges in a different way than some of us in the more urban areas of the state. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. That was all of this information, I think, is extremely significant. I'm so happy that this is being recorded so that people can go back and watch or even rewind and take some notes. And all of these links are going to be found in the chat. And I wanted to just have a little bit of a discussion on some of these topics. And so it's September and everyone is basically back to school in some way, whether that's a hybrid model, whether it's remote, whether it's back into the classroom full time. So in thinking about how educators are now, again, somehow face-to-face with students, what are some things that educators and school staff can do to make sure they're keeping students safe?
I'll go. Well, Jenna gave some good sheets that they can take a look at. Moira gave 211, right? I mean, not every teacher teaches in their community, like she said. So if you don't know, that's a great resource for you to call, or for parents to call if they're saying I'm struggling, right? And I think it's important that if the system can intervene before it gets to the level where kids need to come to our centers, that's fantastic, right? I mean, if people can get services and can get connected with what they need before it gets to the level where there is significant neglect or criminal neglect, or there is physical abuse or things like that, that's what we want. So the sooner the better. I think as soon as teachers start to suspect that there might be something going on, they do need to reach out to families and say, is there something you need? Is there something we can help you with? Certainly if a child discloses to you that they're being abused, or you have a really strong suspicion, you see an injury or whatever, make that report, right? We've hammered that into teachers' minds so many times. But if you suspect something else, kid's dirty, kid maybe hasn't been eating or is indicating they haven't been eating, give the family a call, and try to connect them with resources before it gets to the point where the authorities have to step in. That's what teachers, it's be super helpful.
And I think for those kids who aren't showing up too, if those kids are constantly absent, there could be something right there that needs to be addressed quickly with the administrative staff, or so I think that absenteeism is something to be really aware of.
I think,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry, Moira. I would echo, a lot of what we've heard there. I think, a really important part of it is just, having the conversations with your students, talking to your students. There's really great questions to help guide you through that are on the Know and Tell guide. There's questions to help guide you through that on the Wellbeing guide. A lot of those kind of overlap with each other. But I think using those questions, right, to have conversations with students, and use those questions to have conversations with parents. And particularly, you don't always need to do that in a way that folks feel like it's accusatory, right? It's a recognition that most of our families, all of our families are struggling right now, and just trying to be a support. And I think you'll find by approaching folks that way that you'll probably hear a lot more about what their needs really are, and then be more successful in being able to connect that. And then of course, if you hear something in all of that you're concerned about is abuse or neglect, you must call. But oftentimes it's just having that conversation, being willing to, and that's a big step, because we might not always expect to have those types of conversations with people. Just being brave enough to do that. And I'm sorry, Moira, go ahead.
That's okay. You gave me a good segue. So just, those are difficult conversations to have. And quite frankly, a lot of families don't want you to assume that they're in trouble. But when you flip it, we've found, and we've seen this across the country, how important it is to do what we've been doing with you as teachers, we've been acknowledging how difficult it's been for you. So in that same mode, acknowledge to families how difficult it is. You know, say to a parent, like, this has been really tough. How are you doing with this? Rather than saying, like, do you have enough to eat for your kids? If you just acknowledge to them that it must be hard for them, that gives them an opportunity to sort of open up, because they can see that you're with them and you recognize how hard it is for them. And then you have the opportunity to say, you know, you can call 211, or there's this program, or, you know, there's food, whatever it sounds like they need. And they may not need anything either, except for someone to sort of cares. As I mentioned before, it's very isolating. I mean, this is really isolating. And a lot of parents, as you know, are home stuck teaching and doing your job, which I never realized was so difficult. And so that's even more isolating, because now in front of their children, they're proving how incompetent they are at this sort of stuff. And so they really need to be uplifted a little bit. And that's what keeps families safe, is when everybody's saying, like, yeah, it is hard. Let's like figure out this together.
Yeah, I think you're right. And getting to know more about 211 and what that entails. It was interesting to learn that 211, like somebody might call for 211 for a specific reason, like I'm having some employment issues. And then that person taking the call at 211 automatically knows, okay, well, if you're having some issues with employment, you might be having issues with income, which means maybe purchasing food and some food insecurity and some housing insecurity and instability, and asking the right questions to say, okay, so you maybe came here for this information, but we're going to give you resources for all of this. And I think it's important to note that there are new people struggling. People who've never struggled before are in this new situation they're finding themselves in, and saying, okay, I've never been here before. I don't know this. I don't know what to do. So I think that's, along with all of the other resources mentioned, is definitely important to consider when trying to navigate this.
So Joe, I have a question that teachers might have about that going dark, those kids who aren't engaging online. Is your central intake looking for those conversations when they call? Like, have you had that conversation about technology, and have you kind of tried to eliminate the other barriers before you call about education neglect? Like, what are you guys looking for from teachers for that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Nicole. And yeah, and actually that's alluded to at the bottom of the well-being guide that we referenced before too, if folks want to see a little bit more about it. But it is exactly that, right? We want to make sure that we're not going out to assess or investigate abuse or neglect if what's happening is, a technological barrier or a resource barrier that could be met in some other way. And it's important that we do that. Folks might not realize, although I think a lot of teachers do, because a lot of teachers have hesitancy in calling us, that an investigation is not a neutral act, right? When we go out to investigate a family, it's an act that can be scary to that family, right? And I think we do need to acknowledge that reality. We don't want to go out more than is necessary for that reason. And if we can meet a family's need without having to go out and do an investigation, that's what we want to do. At the same time, a lot of times we need to make those investigations, right? If there's a family that based on prior experience, have some real concerning risk factors, and despite everyone's best efforts in the school district, you're not able to find that family, you should make that report, and we should be going out too, right? It is nuanced. And I think for that reason, I would suggest that, if you're not sure, call, and we'll help you guide you through that decision, right? And help guide you through what kind of is the right result there, and whether the right next step is that we open up an investigation, or whether that right next step is that maybe somebody in the school district have another type of outreach to that family to make sure that they have what they need around resources to connect, to make sure that that child's not missing because maybe they don't have a device, as opposed to them not coming to school for some other reason that we're concerned about. So good question. Thank you, Nicole.
Yeah, Joe, I think that's a really important point, that folks understand that making that call to you does not necessarily mean you're going to come into their home and start removing children, that there will be a very thoughtful, thorough conversation, and that you're looking for details that can help guide sort of the solutions, but not necessarily does it mean removal. And
Absolutely. Yeah, I think people get really afraid that when you call, it means that automatically the child's going to be removed. And if you go back and look at the numbers on that data that I showed, right, we have 12,000 investigations a year. We have like 20,000 calls or so a year. But, there's a few hundred removals, right? So it's a minority of cases that children are actually removed from their homes. what's much more typical is that, we go out and we find something that needs, some assistance, some support, some strengthening for that family. I think the other thing that I'd like to mention here, since we're on the topic, is even when you make that call to intake, you might notice some changes. We've been doing some work at intake around trying to better prepare them to help support callers around connecting families to resources. So rather than just getting a call, rather than making a call and being told, no, this isn't going to be screened in, and that's the end of the call, we've been trying to help our intake workers have access to these resources. Say, okay, well, this isn't something we're going to screen in, but it sounds like this family would be able to be supported by their local family resource center and then give you that information so that you're armed with that to try to support that family going forward. So again, I think, if you're not sure, you should call and let the professionals on the other side of the line, help with that.
Can I follow on that too, Joe? When you're calling, Joe made a point to say that they don't really remove all children. There is sometimes a perception of someone who's calling with concerns about a child that they should be removed. And then there's frustration when they're not. And I think it's important to sort of review that as well. It's not just that the agency is reluctant to do it. There are state and federal laws that require certain things to happen before a child would be removed. There's lots of sort of therapeutic thinking about what's appropriate for a child to be removed. And there's the idea that we seem to understand from science now that children really are better off in their families. It's a matter of supporting families. So you may see that and you may feel frustration if you don't know all of the intricacies of what's happening when DCYF gets that call. And those are a lot of the calls that my office gets where they feel like DCYF is not taking the action they need to take. What I would say to that is that if you continue to see a problem, you can call DCYF again. You shouldn't get frustrated with that agency for not taking a kid and swooping them out of their home right away. But if you don't feel that DCYF is acting in the best interest of the children, you should, instead of just I understand the frustration, but overcome the frustration and make another call, because sometimes there's a little bits of information that starts to gather that helps DCYF first identify really what are the needs of the family and can you help them? And last, if the family can't or won't take care of that child, DCYF will then have all of the information that they need to be able to take that child to safety. So be frustrated and shout out loud, but still make the call and share the information, and call the central intake line too. A lot of folks think they need to find the caseworker that's on the case or that they're aware of that's on the case. And that might be fine, except for that caseworkers sometimes are on vacation, they're doing other things, and they're not going to get your call right away. So central intake is really the best way to get information to DCYF when you're concerned about a child's safety.
Thank you, Moira. Yeah, and there's somebody there 24/7, 365 to take the call, right? So it's always available.
One more thing I think that we could mention too is, as an educator and as all of us on this Zoom are mandated reporters, you yourself as an educator can make that call. You do not have to go through a counselor. You do not have to go through an administrator. If you're having a suspicion, if you have that feeling, if you're going to be thinking about that child before going to bed, you make that call. Don't let anyone tell you no. That's your mandate.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Jenna, that that the quality of information DCYF gets from you is so much better from the information they're going to get that you've passed on to a supervisor or a superintendent or somebody. So it's really important, and you can just say, I'm not sure if this is the right call, but here's what I know, and that will be the most help to DCYF to help that child.
I think to answer the question at the beginning is, what does mandated reporting look like in the time of COVID? Your responsibility is the same. Gathering the information may be more difficult if you're not face-to-face with kids. But we always say in our know and tell trainings that if you feel like you need to report, it's the same in the time of COVID as it is in the time of non-COVID. If you feel like you need to report, make the report. The central intake people are great. They'll walk you through what they need to be walked through. So it really hasn't changed that much. Just the way you gather information has changed, and there's some great resources that are provided for teachers today on how to gather that information. and we hope they're super helpful. No and Tell is not being delivered in person, but you can still take the No and Tell training online. It is 3 hours. I understand that is a lot of time, but you can start and stop. So you can take it at your leisure. And it really does, we did a lot of work with DCYF to make sure it really helps educators understand what it looks like when you make a call and to really try to take some of the anxiety away from that. So if you are inclined to take it, you still can take it. It's free, it's online. Jan is going to provide the link, or it's been provided. And you can start and stop. So you don't have to dedicate it a whole 3 hours to it at once if you don't have the time.
Thank you so much. I previously had planned other questions, but I loved how this conversation just organically formed. So I'm not going to, because I think you've answered many. And the detail in which you provided this information, I hope was very informational and educational to everyone. It certainly was for me as well. I can't thank you enough for doing this and spending time and taking time out of your day to really just kind of talk about these issues. And if there's, I don't know if you have any other things you want to add before we end, or any other questions or thoughts before we end this.
A big thank you to all of our educators.
That's it. Thank you.
I agree. Yes. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.